God's courts are rich and wonderful, but the problem with us is that though we've been to church quite a lot, every week, twice on the Lord's Day, much of the time we haven't really been in God's courts. Because there's a difference. You can have an unbeliever in the church service. He obviously isn't in God's courts. And you can be a believer in God's public worship, but not really enter into His courts, or maybe just peer over the top of the fence and only taste a little bit. That's our problem. A day in God's courts is better than 3 years spent in the most pleasurable activities this world has to offer. And if we balk at it, and if we doubt it, we only reveal the poverty of our spiritual lives. David was right. David knows what he's talking about, not us. David was king after Saul. He was a powerful and wealthy man as king. He had many and varied experiences. David will have had many and various experiences more than any of us. He had, as Psalm 63 verse 2 puts it, seen God's power and glory in His sanctuary. Then, having seen both sides, knowing both sides, he was right in his judgment. A day in thy courts is better than 1,000 spent anywhere else at their best. This is the conviction, beloved, that brings us, and ought to bring us, to church each Lord's Day. Because we believe words of God like this. Believe them perhaps weekly, but do believe them. And it brings us to church too, twice on the Lord's Day. This is the conviction too, a day in thy courts is better than 1,000, which brings us to public worship in the right frame of mind. And that's a lot harder than just turning up in the body. The right frame of mind being the desire to worship the Lord, to hearken and obey His word, to profit from the sacraments, and especially the Lord's Supper, as we did this morning. That's the right approach. With that approach, we will most certainly and definitely benefit spiritually and grow in grace in our Lord Jesus Christ. With that attitude, it is certain that you will benefit. If we have the attitude that a day in God's courts is better than 1,000, we're going to be seeking to bring other people. If you had a holiday which was 10 times better than your previous holiday, going to a place which was 10 times better than all the other places you'd been, if someone asked you, where's a good place? Well, you'd say, well, but if we believe this, then we will want to bring people to worship services. We need more of the Spirit of David, the Spirit of Christ in our hearts. This is the attitude too. A day in thy courts is better than 1,000, which makes us attend, if we're able, a midweek Bible study or a ladies' Bible study. This is the attitude too, which makes us think, hey, there's a lecture here. The first Friday or so in April, and I should be there. I'm preaching as the voice of Christ. To put it the other way, Psalm 84 verse 10, and of course like text, explain to us why many people do not go to a true church or stop going to such a church. The reason why they do not go to a true church or stop going to such a church is that they do not believe Psalm 84 verse 10. A day in thy courts is better than 1,000. What they really believe is a day on the beach is better than a day in God's courts. A day in bed is better than a day spent in God's courts. And never mind a day, it's better than an hour. A day spent watching TV is better than God's courts. In fact, a day doing anything else under the sun is better than a day in God's house. In fact, what they really believe is going to God's house for public worship is about the worst, most boring and miserable thing that you could do on planet Earth. And you know that this is precisely what they do believe and think, because this is what they do. They do these things rather than go to church to praise their Maker and to render Him thanks. They do it week in and week out, year in and year out, and the heart will do what the heart wants to do. There are people, and you have seen them, who spend some of their days sitting on a park bench watching the traffic go by. And have you ever tried to give them a God? Oh, I'm not interested in that. Oh, I wouldn't go to church. I don't want to hear the word of God. But they'll sit there at what must be one of the most boring things, at least to me personally, watching traffic go by. But going to church, hearing the gospel, oh, I couldn't do that. That'd be boring. And you say to yourself, hell is too good for people like that. The God of heaven sends His word on earth, and you'd rather do that. That's how God thinks. He punishes people for such hardness and wickedness of heart. And this is why, too, Hebrews 10 verse 25 puts its finger on the key public mark of apostasy from Jesus Christ, which is falling away from the church's public worship. Quote, forsaking the gathering of ourselves together as the manner of some is. That is the key public mark of apostasy from Christ, not joining the public worship of the Almighty. Instead of doing that, instead of thinking that a day in thy courts is useless, worthless, pointless, dull, we follow the man after God's own heart, and think God's thoughts after him. A day in thy courts is, no matter what they may say, better than 1,000. Which means that we all must strive to be more in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, and as we're in the worship services, seek God truly as we engage in the various elements of the service. And then there's the other comparison in verse 10. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. Literally, the verse reads, I had rather stand at the threshold than dwell in the tents of wickedness. And the threshold here is the threshold not to the tabernacle itself, the tent, but the threshold or entranceway to the court. This isn't talking about at the entryway to the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could go on the Day of Atonement, or at the threshold to the holy place, wherein was the table of showbread and the altar of incense and the candlestick, etc. Only the priest could go there. But this is the threshold to the court. So you're standing there, and then inside a bit is the altar of burnt offerings.